there's a much greater reason than just the Paris Agreement for trying to improve, our energy system, to make it cleaner, to improve air quality, to focus on, the right to a healthy livelihood. And those things are really important. So I suppose the trade-off is appreciating we need to do this for ourselves as a country. And it's not just a geopolitical shift or push that's forcing us to do this. And that will require some very strong and managed conversations, I guess, with industry to try and actively scale back and actively build up new activities.
Hello and welcome to Earthcast, a platform for discussions about bridging the resource gap between people and planet. I am your host, Olivia Taylor, or Olivia Earth on the socials. I have the privilege of interviewing a series of changemakers, thinkers, and disruptors, and asking them about their fields of interest. Together, we will discover fresh perspectives and the most useful levers in society for change. More specifically, we will look at how to solve wicked problems and make decisions at the margin. If you would like to hear more from Earthcast, subscribe and follow us on social media. Earthcast Season 1 explores the just energy transition and unpacks varied topics such as finance, policy, deepening inclusivity, innovative technology, and how to accelerate the transition given climate limitations. Welcome back to the final episode of Season 1. I'm really sad to be bringing this topic to a close, so I've asked Dr Chantal Naidoo to end the season on a high. Chantal is the founder of Rabia Transitions Initiative. She works at the Nexus of finance and sustainability transitions to bring about systemic shifts in the financial system through the actions of policymakers, financial actors, and civil society. She served as a regional advisor to the Green Climate Fund for more than 6 years, supporting African governments to access climate finance. Chantal's work with the Development Bank of South Africa focused on designing green funds, climate finance policies, and designing bespoke renewable energy investment programs. She has a doctorate from the University of Sussex, looking at the role of financial systems in sustainability transition processes. She is presently seconded to the South African presidency, where she serves as the lead researcher to the Presidential Climate Finance Task Team and their mandate to consider the Just Energy Transition Partnership forged at COP26. Thanks again for joining us, Chantal. Let's get straight into the first question. Can you please tell me a little bit more about your journey to renewable energy and climate finance, and why you think it's a useful place for you to apply your skills and enthusiasm?
Thanks for that question, Olivia, and also thanks for the invitation and the introduction to be on the podcast. I've been following some of your work, and so it's a real honor to be on the call with you. Thanks for asking the question about the journey. My work in climate finance really started accidentally, if I can put it that way. I came from investment banking environment, and I really wanted to get completely out of the finance world, and this is 2007. So I started exploring whether I could be an organic cotton farmer. And this is a true story, I promise you. And I started exploring all of the options for that, and then figured out, well, we are sitting with water scarcity. We are dealing with much bigger challenges. And that started a deep journey of, well, what's the finance sector doing to contribute to mitigating and building resilience to climate action? And this was a journey between 2007 and 2009. I was working independently at the time. In 2009, I joined the Development Bank of Southern Africa. Through a lot of support from the senior executive, I was given the opportunity to build out a team and function around environmental finance. And in that role, we were looking at the particular programs and products that the DBSA design in order to provide options for those wanting to invest, to give them environmentally focused financing products and programs, where the DBSA takes a proactive role. So that was the start of that journey around between 2009 onwards. And I stayed at DBSA until 2012. And during that time, it was the Eskom initial blackouts that happened. and the negotiation of Medupe-Kusile loans with the World Bank, as well as the Climate Technology Fund loans that were happening, and this whole activation of a renewable energy investment program. And I was very much involved in that with the bank and with the National Treasury and what is now the IPP office. In terms of designing a program that DBSA could support and provide a project development office in the back end of it. So the journey started in there was a personal inner journey of, just a frustration with regular banking, a recognition that we are strained on the environment, a recognition that finance has a particular role to play. And through the DBSA, I had immense exposure in what we call climate finance, but it started out really as, an environmental finance urging, and then working through the kind of facilities that was coming to the DBSA at the time, specific from some of the bilateral funders and some of the larger climate funds, including the Global Environment Facility, for example. So it was really a fascinating, start to the journey, and the passion has not stopped for it, because, it's a field that just keeps on becoming much more complicated in some respects, but rewarding in others. And where we are at now as a country and as a globe, it's not just about a renewable energy sector. It's about using renewable energy as a driver for systemic change and using finance as a driver for systemic change. So issues have escalated quite significantly to be about contribution more broadly for wide-scale change. So that's why I think it's a useful place for me, as I have a fair amount of experience, even, prior on regular finance. And I always felt unfulfilled only working in pure finance, whereas working on climate finance and renewable energy is more purposeful. And in as much as it's challenging at times, there's just a resolve to keep going.
Chantal, thank you so much for telling me about your journey. So the next thing I wanted to discuss with you is a breakdown of what an energy transition is in the global context. What are some of the enabling factors for a deep and just transition? And what are the barriers to this? What makes an energy transition challenging? And perhaps what are the unique funding needs for financing just transition investment portfolios in South Africa? And what have you noticed to be the most pressing trade-offs, and why?
Thanks, Olivia. Those are very important and critical questions you are asking there. If I may respond to them from the perspective of the work that I was really privileged to do last year through the Presidential Climate Finance Task Team on assembling the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan and looking through the financing options and partnerships that were being made available to South Africa. The energy transition from a global context, what makes that challenging? I think if you look at the geopolitical environment and moment we find ourselves in right now, is that at times it's 2 steps forwards and then 10 steps back. And even at a national level, it's very similar. So theoretically, we should be able to preserve the fact that we have a growing emissions profile just globally, and we're not doing nearly enough to be able to get on track for 1.5 to 2 degree temperature increase globally. And that should be a driving force in some respects. But there are social aspects, there are incumbencies, so vested interest in existing industries, real lives that matter, and then economic challenges. South Africa is a case in point that even with a energy system as we have, we are not able to offer a secure energy system. So how do we have a conversation about shift to a clean energy system when we're not moving off a strong baseline? So energy transitions are not just technical about shifting from coal to clean technologies for energy generation. There is that dimension. And within that dimension is a whole host of things around whether a country has the capabilities to, and the technologies and access to the technologies and the trade relationships to bring on board those technologies in a way that is, meets the needs of the country, is at a cost base that is, compatible with what the country can afford, for example. To what extent is there local content, local manufacturing, and bringing through that technical and technological advancements that need to happen? And is there room for local industrialization? So there's a myriad of things that stand just behind the technical and the technological aspects of it. And then what technologies are fit for purpose in what regions? We've got both solar and wind resource capabilities in South Africa, and quite significant. But they're also from a geographic perspective, they're located in certain spaces. And that leads to the social dimension, that some spaces are like Mpumalanga, Limpopo area, they are highly concentrated in the coal energy perspective. The ability to put in place, cleaner technologies, those might not be the best locations, for example. I'm not saying that they're not, but they might not be. But there's this trade-off between what we need to stop and what we need to start, and then where do we actually do that? And how do we address the vulnerabilities that comes across as a result of the disruption of that energy transition to the livelihoods of people, those that depend on them, the indirect businesses that might be supporting those industries, or even the workers, the coal mining workers, the power plant workers, and the local municipalities that are dependent on certain flows, on certain industries within their towns. So it's really complex, that transition space, because it's not as easy as, okay, well, let's just build a new clean power plant and then off we go. It's really challenging. What does it mean in a global sense to implement the Paris Agreement and the disruption that comes with doing that? And at a local sense, it speaks to, we are coming off a very difficult base as a country in terms of our socioeconomic dynamics. How do we honor the fact that we don't want people to be worse off, and in fact we need them to be far better than they are in the current situation, in a far better situation than they are at the minute. So I've spoken quite a bit about the challenging part of it, and I think these also speak to some of the factors that make a deep and just transition quite challenging. Justice would speak to elements of, I think the president calls it, bring everybody along. And others have called it, build back better, for example. But we can't ignore, for a country like South Africa, we're coming off a very challenging base in terms of justice. Our political transition created a certain dynamic, and an energy transition and a transition linked to environmental goals is likely to create a certain dynamic as well. And we can't look forward without trying to mitigate some of the past challenges we've had. So that's, from a justice perspective, I think that's a key driver for the entire economy. From a deep perspective, deep would mean that at a point in time, every industry, and way of life in this country is not so heavily dependent on the fossil fuel industry in such a way that, and we have got alternative industries, businesses that has been put in place to support, a greener or more circular economy, for that matter. I think a deep transition is extremely challenging for a country like South Africa to achieve in the short term. So it would be decadal. The Just Energy Transition Investment Plan recognizes that there are decadal elements to it. So it's a 5-year plan focused on 3 sectors with elements of justice and other components embedded in that, and an aim for a deep transition, particularly around ownership structures, infrastructure, the grid, municipal support, skills development. So those systemic factors would drive what a deep transition means for me. Not only a project-based approach, but a systemic approach where there's a cluster of activities that supports a new way of being. And that's what one transitions to. Perhaps your next question was around the funding needs, right, Olivia? So let me pick up on that a little bit. The funding needs in an individual sense is probably what we might be familiar with. You're thinking about a project. It has certain components. There's project development support. There's actual funding of technology. There's support around skills, all of those bits and bobs. But in my experience working with the Presidential Climate Finance Task Team last year, it wasn't so much about those unique project level needs, in as much as they are really important. But what's unique about financing a transition is that we needed funding to be in aggregate available. And by that, I mean to fund a portfolio means that you need a facility, but the facility needs to accommodate for both income generating and non-income generating components that actually are all interdependent to achieve that environmental, social, and economic outcomes as a result of the transition. So, for example, the environmental outcome is to try and get us onto a pathway aligned with South Africa's nationally determined contributions over time. The social component is to do this in a just and equitable way and address the vulnerabilities. And the economic component speaks to making sure that all of these efforts can still preserve regional, national, economic growth and diversification. So there's lots of layers and factors that come into play in terms of how an energy transition portfolio might be funded. And the challenge will be, what is the relationship between public and private capital? Is there risk sharing between them, or is the state expected to pick up certain aspects and private sector will only pick up other aspects if it aligns to risk and return profiles? So it challenges the risk relationship and reward conversation between public and private capital quite significantly. And it also challenges how funding is actually provided and what that portfolio looks like. We need funding to support a basket of activities without individual funders cherry picking only certain parts of that basket, because that's what suits them. Because if we cherry pick, it's like unpicking a beautiful tapestry. If you pull out one thread, the entire picture will unravel. And it's very similar, the energy transition. That's a very interconnected elements and components, some of which generate income, some which don't. But those that don't generate might be the prerequisite for those that do generate income. And it's having that maturity of investment mindset to appreciate, there are elements that have to be funded in order to achieve that ultimate outcome, not only let profit, be the driver. Because the energy transition is not about making money, even though there are elements, of course, where for sure one will generate and one needs that to happen. But there are other factors to also come into play. I think the pressing trade-offs that you referenced, we are at a really difficult juncture, I think, this moment in the country, where we are at stage 6 load shedding. And there's a lot of noise in the press and conversations where people are validly asking questions about what's going on in the global north around their energy transition relative to South Africa. Partly for me, that the pressing trade-off is appreciating that we're not doing this for the Paris Agreement. We're doing this to improve to improve a quality of life. And especially, I've seen some harrowing footage of livelihoods, and also beautiful work by Dalen Paul on his photojournal Broken Land. And so there are lives that are, that are broken in some respects as a result of, what we don't see. We put on the lights at home and then you have the electricity, but close to the proximity of where power plants are, where coal mines are, there's a very different country, there's a very different kind of livelihoods. And for me, he brought those pictures into the room, and that showed that there's a much greater reason than just the Paris Agreement for trying to improve, our energy system, to make it cleaner, to improve air quality, to focus on, the right to, a healthy livelihood. And those things are really important. So I suppose the trade-off is appreciating we need to do this for ourselves as a country. And it's not just a geopolitical shift or push that's forcing us to do this. And that will require some very strong, and managed conversations, I guess, with industry to try and actively scale back and actively build up new activities.
Wow, I don't even know where to begin, because that was such an incredible breakdown. And I feel like I bombarded you with 1,000 questions, and you managed to capture that in such a succinct and accessible way. So thank you very much. I want to talk about Rabia Transitions Initiative, where you're working now. And I want to understand, how are you practically enabling financial actors to finance and contribute to a just and inclusive transition for South Africa?
Sure, Olivia, happy to do that. So a little bit about Rabia is the primary focus is exactly as you say, to help support financial actors in their contribution to a just and inclusive transition. And my take was that they are change agents and really strong, passionate people within many of the financial actor institutions that we have in our country. So what Rabia has been doing is offering research support into some of those spaces to address and work with them on the intractable questions that they have. Because one of the hardest questions, I think, which we all have on an individual basis is, where do we start? How do you even start thinking about what your contribution needs to be? And everybody's got a different starting point. And added to that, there's also an element of, where do we start, but how do I know that what we're doing is going to complement what others are doing, so that collectively and systemically, all of our efforts can contribute to that just and inclusive transition? And the financial system as a whole, I guess, is the space that we are trying to work in, but working with sort of specific actors. So some of our work has involved engaging with central banks and working through how they are able to, engage with the narrative of a just transition, the narrative of climate risk. What does it mean in terms of their risk management frameworks, and how do they develop practical tools in order to engage on those elements through their respective mandates? Working with different finance ministries, for example, and other policy think tanks to also start questions around, what are the questions that we need to ask in the most elemental form to be able to contribute. And some of those might be, what kind of a policy statement is necessary for a finance ministry to engage on in terms of supporting, let's say, fiscal support into green industries? What would that look like, so that you don't create dependency on the state, but you create scaffolding so that the state can responsibly exit and industry can pick up? So you don't want to create permanent support structures necessarily, especially if it's income generative. And other aspects of our work has been to help offer technical analysis, and maybe analysis not quite the right word, but rather help community and civil society groups who are trying to understand some of the technical material that's coming out around financing a just transition and just climate finance in general. So we've been offering, to the extent that this might be useful for others, some kind of interventions on that. So discussing things like the Just Transition Framework, for example. What might that mean? What might be the financing elements of that? And how might that make a difference? So a large part of what we do is probably, I wouldn't say undercover. I would say it's more grassroots. Beyond grassroots, it's undergrass, really. It's about the messy space where we're not even quite sure how to interpret aspects, and then to try and help them sense make and also find a way of connecting their mandate to the issues at hand. So that's been our work. We are very young. We're not even 2 years old yet as an institution, and we are finding that the way of work, which is more about conversations, to engage on some of the harder questions and find an entry point that makes sense for that financial actor, and also bringing to them different aspects of, how does your work relate to what, for example, if it was a central bank, it would be, how is your work relate to what, a stock exchange might be doing, or the finance ministry might be doing? Is your work in unison with everything else? So knitting together more of a systemic, cohesion, just through questions, really.
I think that the work that you're doing is incredible, and it's one of the reasons that I asked you to come and join me on the podcast. So I really appreciate your contributions and your really in-depth and nuanced answers to complex questions, not complicated questions, very complex questions. So I wanted to move into a discussion about how you think we can accelerate the just energy transition. Despite global political instability and in the wake of a pandemic?
I've been thinking about that a lot lately, especially in light of, the last 2 months and also the rolling, load shedding schedules we've had, and then the knock-on effect that's had on countries that are dependent on South Africa. And I think for the African region, the just energy transition is perhaps the narrative needs to be inverted. Fundamentally, we're talking about energy security and energy access. And we're talking about the quality of life and a dignified life for vulnerable people, for small and medium businesses that are, as we saw in the pandemic, the vulnerabilities in our society are really stark, and many did not recover from the lockdowns that ensued. And I think the load shedding is also creating even more vulnerability. So there's a lot of comparable between those two. So I think the just transition, the just energy transition at the minute seems to be, we lead on that, but perhaps we need to lead on energy security, energy access, dignified quality livelihoods as the goal, because a just energy transition helps support that. It's an answer to a question, but what is the question that we're trying to answer? It isn't emissions reduction. It isn't necessarily, building resilience to climate change. That's a very defensive, fear-based answer, even though we have to do that. But ultimately, we are, beings on a planet, and everybody wants the quality and chance to have a productive livelihood. I think the just energy transition helps, make that possible. So despite political instability, there's a lot that ordinary citizens could do that business can already do. And I've often said, and it's something that really angers me whenever conversations come up, there's often, not always, but often a narrative that, well, we need government to do this and that, and they need to change the policy, and only then can we act. And it's a global, regional, and national type of comment that one has heard over the years since I started working in this space. But of late, I've been thinking, yes, but I get that. However, are all of the actors, public and private, acting within their mandate of existing policies and acting within the mandate of existing spheres of influence? Has private sector maxed out what they can do in terms of a contribution to the just energy transition, or are they waiting for some specific policy from government? Don't we have enough already? So that for me is one of the key drivers on accelerating the energy transition, is to take ownership, and for every actor to take ownership and to stop blaming others and to stop making excuses, because there's actually a lot we can do.
So Chantal, unfortunately, we've come to our last question. And this concludes season 1 of the Just Energy Transition, which is pretty overwhelming for me. I can't believe it's season 1 done. And I so appreciate you being the season closer. So to get to the final question, the question that I always bother my guests with, given your expertise, what question should I have asked you, Chantal?
Good question. And I'm also very excited to be the season closer. I did pick up that as a note there. So it's a badge that I do expect you to issue to me, please. So
it's going to be emailed. It's going to be posted to you soon.
Thank you. One of the key questions that you might want to explore in future series perhaps is something very specific on finance. So, given you might have wanted to ask me, in my view, what is the international and national finance architecture suited to support a just energy transition? Why is such a question useful is that what came out of the COP27 narratives was this recognition that we need to reform the international finance architecture because it's actually not compatible with Paris. It's not compatible with the vision of transition and building resilience. So it is quite a finance-specific type question. And I think maybe a corollary to that would be around the preconditions from the state in terms of allowing justice and social and the social safety nets that need to be in place for a just transition, because there's some key drivers and best practices, and one of those is the recognition that we need very strong social protection safety nets. Do we have that in South Africa to deliver on a just transition is the question. So those would be my two. Olivia, I know you only gave me one question, but I gave you two.
Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Next episode, I will be asking more creatives and intellectual disruptors about making decisions at the margin. See you next time.